Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 11 of the Ecce textbook titled A Slave Runs Away. And in this story you're going to be reading about the slave Geta who we met a couple chapters ago, and he's going to run away from the farm. And Dawes, the overseer, is going to be hunting him down. The grammar for this chapter is really important because we're going to be looking at the genitive case. So we'll be returning to nouns and adjectives and filling out our case endings one more time. The genitive has to do with possession, and it's a really important idea in Latin. So to start, we're going to look at the vocabulary, and again, we're going to be looking at derivatives. The first word we're going to look at is dominus, which in Latin means the lord or the master. And in English, this leads to derivatives such as dominate, dominion, domain, don, and even dungeon. And all five of these words have to do with the lord or the master of the house. So if you think of a domain, it's the area that someone rules. They're the lord over that area. The same goes for dominion and dominate. If you're dominating someone, it means you're lording over them. And in the Romance languages, this leads to words that all mean lord or master in Spanish, French, and Italian. And you'll notice these are also the words for Sunday, which of course in Christianity is the Lord's Day. So that's why these words in Spanish, French, and Latin have the word for Lord inside of them. From plenus, which means full, we get the words plenty, plentiful, plentitude, and replenish. And they all have to do with being full of something. So if you're replenishing something, you're filling it up again. And if you say something is plentiful, it means there's a lot of it there. It's full. Verberare means to beat or to hit in Latin. And this leads to the English derivative reverberate. This makes sense because if you think about the definition for reverberate, it's when something has been hit by something else and now that object is shaking. And again, the reverberation part goes back to verberare, which means to beat or to hit. Ira means anger in Latin, and from this we get the words irate and irascible. They mean the same thing. You're talking about being angry. If someone is irate, they're full of anger. Illa nocte means that night in Latin. And in English, from nocte we get the word nocturnal, which we've seen before. It means having to do with the night. Illa, though, means that in Latin, and you're going to learn this later on, but it leads to a couple of different words from the Romance languages, including la, le, il, and el in French and Spanish. And they all mean that or the in the Romance languages. They're coming from this Latin root, illa, which means impedio, impedire means to hinder someone. And in English, this leads to derivatives like impediment, impede, and impeach. If you impede someone, it means you're getting in their way. The same goes for an impediment. It's something that's in your way or hindering you. Porta means door or gate in Latin. And in English, it leads to the words portal, porch, portico, and port. And if you think about the definitions for all four words, they have to do with a gate or a doorway into something else. So if you think of a porch, that's how you get into someone's house. The door to the house is usually through the porch. Soror sororis means sister in Latin. And in English, we get the words sororal and sorority. So if you think of a college sorority, it's a group of women or sisters. It has that Latin root right in the word. Means brother in Latin. And in English, this leads to words like fraternal, fraternity, and fraternize. And again, all three of these words have to do with brother or brotherhood. So if you think of a fraternity, just like a sorority was a group of women or sisters, a fraternity is a group of men or brothers. It's holding on to that root for brother. And the same goes for fraternal and fraternize. From filius and philia, which mean son and daughter, respectively, we get the words affiliation, filial, and affiliate. And again, these are the exact same word, just a different gender to represent son and daughter. But if you think of these three English derivatives, they're all holding on to that same root of your son or a daughter. And in the Romance languages, you can see the words for son show up in Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, and it's almost the exact same spelling. This brings us to the grammar for chapter 11, which is the genitive case. So again, we're going to be coming back to nouns and adjectives and learning one more case to go with them. So far, we've seen how sentences can be expanded by the use of adjectives. So for instance, if I gave you the sentence Davus ad magnam portam stat, you would translate it, Davus stands near the large. The adjective here is magnam, or large. It's describing the noun portam, or door. In other words, you're saying what kind of door? A large door. But we can also expand our sentences by modifying one noun with another noun instead of an adjective. And for this, we use the genitive case. Look at a few example sentences. For instance, if we had Aurelia est mater, we would translate this, Aurelia is the mother. It's a pretty straightforward Latin sentence. But if we wanted to expand that a little bit, you might say Aurelia est mater Marci, which means Aurelia is the mother of Marcus. And you'll notice here that we've added in the word Marci, which means of Marcus. This word is the genitive, and you can see it's a noun, it's a proper name, and it's modifying the word mater. So it's almost acting like an adjective. And you can think of it this way. You're saying, what kind of mother is Aurelia? She's the mother of Marcus. It's giving us more detail about that noun mater. And you also want to notice the positioning. The genitive is always going to come right after the word it's modifying. So we know in this case, it's not saying Aurelia of Marcus, it's saying mother of Marcus. The genitive is coming right after the noun it goes with. Let's look at a few more sentences. So if we had servi baculum timent, which means the slaves fear the stick. Again, it's a pretty simple sentence. So let's expand it a little bit. Servi baculum vilici timent. Now we have the slaves fear the stick of the overseer. And again, we've added in this word, vilici, which is a noun in the genitive case. It means of the overseer. And it's modifying the noun baculum. You're saying what kind of stick? The stick of the overseer. It's giving you more detail about this noun. And again, the positioning of the genitive is right after the noun that it's modifying. Definition for the genitive case. In its simplest form, the genitive case is used when you want to modify one noun with another noun. And this pair of nouns is going to make one single phrase. So for instance, back in the previous sentence, we had the stick of the overseer. You have two nouns here, stick and overseer, and they're forming one single phrase. You have the genitive of the overseer modifying the word stick. This is what the genitive case is all about. And one way to think about it is the genitive is most often used to show possession. So in other words, you're saying the stick belongs to the overseer. It's his possession. Another way to translate this in English would be to use apostrophe s. So you could say the overseer's stick. It's just easier in Latin, to me anyway, to translate it of. If you translate with the of instead of apostrophe s, you'll always be able to tell where the genitive is. So again, we usually translate the genitive with the word of, and the reason we want to do this instead of the apostrophe s in English is it's a little easier to notice when you're looking at an English translation. So if we had servus Corneli, this means the slave of Cornelius. Quista Marci, the trunk of Marcus. Amica Cornelii, the friend of Cornelia. All three of these are the genitive case, and we're translating it of to show the possession. We can also use the genitive to expand the meaning of adjectives. So we were just looking at expanding the meaning of nouns. We can also use it with adjectives. So for instance, aria est plena servorum. We translate this, the open space is full of slaves. And you'll notice here the genitive is servorum, of slaves. And it's modifying not a noun, but the adjective plena, which means full. So you're saying full of what? Full of slaves. The word servorum is modifying that adjective. So let's have a quick recap of the cases we've learned so far. And so far we've seen 5 of them: the nominative, the genitive, the accusative, the ablative, and the vocative. So remember, the nominative case is used to show the subject of the verb. The genitive case we now see shows possession, and we're always translating it of. The accusative case we've seen is the direct object of the verb. And so far, the only use of the ablative we've seen is when it's in a prepositional phrase. And remember, it shows position or location, or motion away from or out of. And finally, the vocative case we know is when you're directly addressing someone. So this brings us to the next piece of grammar for this chapter. Just a quick review of the cases and declensions now that we've added in the genitive case. So if we look at our chart so far of noun endings, this is what we started with up until this chapter. We had nominative, accusative, ablative, and vocative. Now though, we can fill out the rest of our chart with these two new cases, the genitive, which we just saw, and the dative, which is a case that we haven't seen yet, but we're going to learn in more detail later on in the book. But for right now, you still want to memorize its ending, just so you have a full picture of the chart, and this will help you moving forward. Now there's a couple of things you want to know before we move on. First thing you want to notice is that in the first declension singular, the genitive and the dative have the exact same ending of AE. This might look confusing, but once you learn what the dative is used for, it's actually easy to tell them apart, and we'll be working on that later on in the book. The other thing you want to notice is that for the first and second declension plural endings, the genitive is pretty close in first and second declension. It's almost spelled the exact same way. But you'll notice in first declension it's a long A, which makes sense because we've been seeing the letter A a lot there. And in the second declension it's a long O, which also makes sense because we've been seeing O show up specifically in the second declension. So just keep those two straight. For the dative plural, in first and second declension, you'll notice that it's the exact same ending in both declensions. Again, this might look confusing, but once you practice it, you'll be able to tell them apart. If you ever see a word ending in that long IS and you know it's dative, you want to think back to what its genitive singular is so you can tell what declension it belongs to. And finally, look at the dative and ab plural across all three declensions, and you'll notice that it's the exact same thing. For the dative, we have is ibus, and for the ablative, we have is ibus across the first, second, and third declensions. Again, this might look confusing, but once you figure out what the ablative is used for and what the dative is used for later on in the book, it'll be easier to tell these two apart. Specifically, we want to remember the genitive case, which we've been using in this chapter. That's how you can tell what declension a word belongs to, because look at the ending across the first, second, and third declensions. It's something different every time. This means if you know that the genitive singular of a word ends in AE, it has to belong to the first declension. If the genitive singular is a long I, it has to be second declension. And if the genitive singular is an IS, it has to be third declension. This is why the genitive is so important. So again, in your textbook and in any dictionary you pick up, Latin nouns are always listed with four specific pieces. You're going to see the nominative singular, the genitive singular, the gender of the word, and its English translation. So for instance, let's look at this entry for girl. If you look this up in a dictionary or in the back of your book, you're going to see puella, puellae, f dot, and then girl. Puella is the nominative singular. Puellae is the genitive singular, so it means of the girl. The f dot is telling you the gender. In this case, the word girl is feminine. And finally, you see the English translation here, girl. This is always how words will be listed in any dictionary you pick up. So just a quick recap of what I said before. The genitive singular ending indicates the declension to which a noun belongs, meaning if the genitive singular is either an AE, a long I, or an IS, you can easily associate that back with a specific declension. Doing this will help you know what endings to use, especially if you're not entirely sure. Or, like we said, in the dative and ablative, the endings overlap, so sometimes you won't be able to tell them apart. Knowing the declension of the word will help you out with this, and it starts by knowing the genitive singular. So if you look closely at our noun ending chart, you'll notice that the spelling of a word changes slightly when it's in a particular case, especially in the third declension. So what do I mean by this? Let's take the example of vox vocis, which is the entry for voice. Just like with Latin verbs, Latin nouns have a base, and you add on all your case endings to this base. So if you think back to verbs, we've learned how to find the present stem of a verb from looking at its infinitive ending. It's the same idea here. You can think of Latin nouns as having a stem, we just call it a base. And to find this base, you have to go to the genitive singular and drop the genitive ending. This is why it's important to memorize the genitive when you're doing vocabulary, because it will help you with all the other case endings. So for instance, with the word wokes, which means voice, if you didn't know this rule, you might think that the genitive would be woksis, because it's a third declension word, and you know the third declension genitive singular ending is is. So you might get words like woksis, or wokesy, woksem, or wokse. These are the third declension endings. The problem with this, though, is that we know that the genitive of wokes is wokus. This is why it's so important to memorize genitive, because since the genitive is wokus, we can see that the base is voc, not vox. And we get this by going to the genitive of wokus, and you'll notice that the stem has changed a little bit. Instead of vox, it's voc. If you drop the is off that genitive ending, you're left with your of voc. Now we can add in our other endings to get words like wokey, wokem, and woke. These are the correct way to spell the forms of this noun. And again, this is why it's so important to know the genitive ending, specifically the singular. And your book will always list for you the genitive from now on in the vocabulary. You have to take a note of it because of this rule. Using the genitive singular, we can find the spelling for all other cases for a particular noun.